Vern Kennedy did a new poll on the governor's race, released the information last week, calling it an independent poll, some say. I'm not sure how independent it was. What surprised you in that? It shows Eddie Rispone gaining ground on Congressman Abraham. Anything in that poll surprise you?
No, not particularly, given the way it's constructed, the sampling and the like. Yeah, the results I saw were probably pretty consistent with what I figured was going to come out of that.
I just spoke with Mr. Kennedy just a few moments ago, and he said he couldn't talk to us about it because that wasn't allowed under his agreement with whoever paid him for it. What do you know about that? Who's behind this one?
It's a number of businessmen. It's been a kind of a rotating roster for the last 25 or so years. We do know John Georges is one of them. He's the publisher of The Advocate, and that's why The Advocate is the one that runs those stories.
The numbers that Kennedy show that John Bel Edwards at almost 52% when you redistribute the undecided voters. That number kind of jumped out at me. I'm thinking, I don't know that can be right. What do you think about that number?
Yeah, it should, because it's inconsistent with every other poll that's been done in this contest. And there are reasons why, mainly dealing with this sampling. There are a couple things about it which tend to overestimate the support for Edwards, and in particularly his resampling strategy, where he takes undecided black respondents and automatically, or almost automatically, puts them in the Edwards camp without really understanding that a lot of these people who are participating and saying they're undecided are simply not going to vote when it comes to October.
Ah, interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
Do you think that because we see this more and more now that in this political day and age, where polls are commissioned and the purpose of polls is to sway voters by their results more than it is to get necessarily an accurate feel for what people are thinking. Do you think this is a poll like that?
Well, some of that's going on, but in this case, I think it's just the sampling strategy that Kennedy picks is one that's very divergent from the others that are being used in this race, and in fact a lot done in political polling. So, I think the problem here is the sample, and the sample is picked, and again, I don't think it's done intentionally to sway it, but it is picked in a way that does tend to overestimate the vote intention for Edwards.
Kennedy also did a projection again in a runoff with Edwards versus Abraham and Edwards versus Rispone, and Edwards wins against both of those men. Again, it's redistributing the undecided voters. Is that the flaw in this logic?
Well, partly, but really it's more the sample itself. The sample, if he's using the same parameters as he did for the previous one, it came out a month or two ago, if he's doing the same stuff, then it's going to oversample people that are likely to vote for Edwards, and that's where the problem is. That's why it's so divergent from other polls.
So let's look at this a poll of this type historically. Going back maybe 4 years to the previous governor's race, if these same people did the poll, how did their polls turn out then?
Kennedy has a pretty decent record for at least polling in the Louisiana environment. But 4 years ago, people, if anything, were underpolling what Edwards would do when the primary or general election actually rolled along. And that's when we're doing state level polls, that does tend to be a problem. There's less precision, more variance out there that is really difficult to catch. So, the best way to look at this is to look at the universe of polls in the contest. And again, this one really stands out as an outlier. So, if I had to make an educated guess the way things really are in the electorate at this moment when a poll's being taken, I'd say this one, again, overestimates Edwards' support.
But on the other hand, Dr. Jeff, and the actual polls don't come to mind, but this is not the first one that says Edwards, in fact, has a pretty good chance of garnering more than 50% in the general election, right?
Well, there was one, but a couple months ago, I think, that again, if you look at the sample, it had some. The sample was an outlier in a sense, but no, that almost every other one has said much the opposite. That Edwards really has little chance of winning without a runoff.
Risponi is the big gainer in this poll, everyone is saying. And you know, we all know he loaned his campaign $10 million, and they're saying he's buying the name recognition he needs. Pretty accurate?
Well, yeah, if you're an unknown like he is, I mean, certainly you do have to spend a certain core amount of dollars in order to be able to get that kind of name recognition. You really can't go anywhere without it. So yeah, that's certainly true, and it doesn't mean that if you go and spend all outdoors, you're going to, quote, buy enough votes to win an election. But you do need enough money spent so you can get to a position where then other kinds of things can take over to increase your share of the vote.
Yeah, I hope I didn't misunderstand, but if you were saying a couple of seconds ago that in your mind this poll sort of slants toward the Edwards camp, and yet it shows Risponi is getting a pretty good bump, could the Risponi bump in fact be greater than this poll showed?
Possibly. If you're taking a sample that's a little more pro-Edwards than the population actually is, then yeah, you'd have to be eating support away from the other candidates. Now, whether it's disproportionately coming from Risponi or Abraham or people that are not going to vote or undecided, we don't know, but it's a possibility.
You've got your pulse on this part of the state specifically. Abraham, this is something Aaron's brought up repeatedly. Do you think that Abraham and Risponi are at this point as well known in this part of the state as they need to be?
No, probably not. I mean, if need to be is defined as close to universal in a sense, which would be where Edwards is because of his almost 4 years in office, then no, and you're, as a challenger, you may never get to that point, but you can get to a point which is not far from that, and that's I don't know that they're there yet, but they're getting much closer. And
in this part of the state, do you think there will be a sort of where Republican name recognition may not really matter, where it's just the he's not Edwards vote?
To a certain degree, this part of the state's always been the least receptive to Edwards. So any ABE maybe that's a dynamic that certainly could be driving these results.